Welcome to everyone. Welcome, thank you very much for coming this evening to what is our first panel discussion, roundtable discussion of the year by the Exeter Centre for International Law. International lawyers often get accused by political realists of being concerned too much with rules. And of course, international law is to a large extent about rules, but it is also about other things. In particular, it is about what Dame Rosalind Higgins, a former British judge at the International Court of Justice, called process. International law is not just about rules, but also about decision making. It is about values, and it is also about interests. And most of the time, it is about competing values and competing interests. So this is why a document like the United States National Security Strategy, which has been published very recently in its latest iteration in December last year, this is why a document like that is of interest to international lawyers as well as to students of strategy. It is not just about rules, obviously, but it is about process as well. There have been 16 national security strategies published by the United States of America, if I've got my numbers correct. But this latest one has been very eagerly anticipated, partly because of the security environment that we are facing today. If you think about North Korea, it's obviously very interesting to hear what the national security strategy has to say, if anything, about how to deal with North Korea. But equally, it was eagerly anticipated because of what we might want to call the idiosyncrasies of the Trump administration itself. I'm delighted that we have two fantastic speakers here today, this evening, to discuss the national security strategy with us. Our first speaker, should we have discussed, did you agree on an order?
Yeah.
Patrick, do you want to go first?
Sure.
So our first speaker is Professor Patrick Porter, who is a professor of strategic studies here at the University of Exeter. He's the academic director of the Strategy and Security Institute at Exeter. He also holds a number of positions outside of the university, including being a senior associate fellow of the Royal United Services Institute in London. Our second speaker is Professor Michael Schmitt, who is a professor of public international law at Exeter. In addition, he also holds a number of external appointments, including being the Stockton Professor at the United States Naval War College, and he's also the Lieber Distinguished Scholar at the Lieber Institute of the United States Military Academy at West Point. We're very grateful to have you both here today. I know you've been teaching before, so thank you very much for coming at such a relatively late hour and enlighten us about the topic of tonight's roundtable. So Patrick, can I ask you to talk? Correct.
Thanks very much, Oral. I hope you can all hear me at the back. I have a number of bones to pick with Oral, actually. We're great old antagonists on a number of issues. But much more seriously, this is a disappointingly dry event. And it's in the anniversary of Donald Trump's inauguration on the 20th this week coming up, which I tend to react to with booze. So shame on you, Oral, for that. Secondly, shame on you for using a photo of me from 7 years ago to advertise this event where I was 7 years and 3 tons ago. I'm a much prettier man now. I should have to update my publicity. And thirdly, I want to talk a bit about, in a way, this very boring document that the Trump administration has issued after all this excitement and build-up. National Security Strategy of the United States of late 2017 is really very non-Trumpian in its themes and its style. It's not exactly the same as those of Obama, Bush, Clinton, Bush. But it's much more samey than we thought. And I think that's very significant. And I think that even if this president won't read this document, I think we ought to read it. Because it actually does tell us quite a lot about the pattern of what we've had so far for a year and the pattern of things to come. There is, and the reason I'm saying that is that there is a very powerful argument made a lot that we don't need to read this document. This document is dead on arrival. This document is a waste of a forest. And really, this is said for two reasons. Firstly, that there's a general problem with this genre anyway, that any national security strategy published for the whole world to download and for America's adversaries to devour in Tehran and Moscow and Beijing is a waste, because it's not going to say anything, because they don't want to show their hand. So it has to be a banal document that doesn't say very much at all. The whole point of this is to conceal and hold things back and not to show us anything. In other words, that this is a signalling document, not a truly strategic document. And the second reason people say it's a bit of a waste of time is that very quickly Trump appeared to disown the claims of the document in a speech he made to launch it. It was violently at odds with what the document was saying, whereas the document reaffirmed America's commitment to primacy, to leadership, to preponderance in key regions, to the reassurance of allies, to counter-proliferation, to the open economic door on America's terms, to all of those very traditional things which Hillary Clinton would have been mostly at home with. And yet Trump's speech ignored this, and he reverted back to the Trump of the campaign trail of 2016. The nativism, the anti-immigration sentiment, the imperial fatigue, that Americans are sick of the burdens of being a global cop and others should do more and others are free riding on America's back. The general narcissism of it all, Trump's own version of exceptionalism, where it's not America that is the shining light on the hill, but the President of the United States that is the shining light on the hill. So there seems to be this very troubling dissonance between what the administration says about itself in the cold light of day and the way Trump talks about it. And yet, what I want to argue is that actually this still is quite significant. American foreign policy isn't just made by one man. It can't be. And secondly, we need to look beyond the spectacle. To only talk about what the president tweets or says is, I think, in a way, to fall prey to Trumpism. It's to fall prey to the bread and circuses and the acts. It's a lot less glamorous, but a lot more productive to look at what this administration actually does. It doesn't mean words don't matter, of course they matter, and Trump's inconsistency and his rhetoric are very destabilising things. But below that, I want to argue that tradition, at the grand strategic level, tradition is racking up a lot of quiet victories as we go. We should be just as alive to the continuities of American behaviour at the very first order level. These documents actually, despite the fact that everyone can download them and read them, despite the fact that there is every incentive not to be too revealing, and despite the fact that they're not very strategic, they don't give you very much of an idea of means and ends, they do tend to tell us quite a lot about the administrations that produce them. If you go back in time, the ones by Ronald Reagan, by Bill Clinton, by Barack Obama, by George Bush Sr., George Bush Jr., they tended in general to point towards an overarching logic of behaviour. Bush Jr. talked about preventive war and democracy promotion and the war on terror. Obama talked about the Asia pivot, or the need to refocus attention on Asia and legitimising American power. Bill Clinton, like Trump now, talks about economic reconstruction as the basis for national regeneration. And that was broadly true as an indicator. And what you have with this thing is very much an intramural debate within the administration and between administrations about how best to carry out American primacy. This is not a debate about different grand strategies. This is a debate about tactical debate about how to implement and reinforce American leadership in the world. So let's look at some of these quiet victories. If we just do a Cook's tour of the world, in Europe, it's interesting. The further east you go in Europe, the more pleased are the European democracies with Trump's leadership. It's in the Western Europe that they're disturbed by him, but the further east they go, the more alarmed they are about Russian aggression and Russian adventurism, the more delighted they are that they have this president, who is actually reinforcing NATO. He is reinforcing Barack Obama's what's known as the European Reassurance Initiative after the Ukraine crisis to pour money and training and munitions into Europe. To arm Poland with Patriot missiles, to sell lethal arms to the Ukraine, to allow for further enlargement of NATO, the integration of Montenegro. Okay, it was done very rudely. Trump pushed the president out of the way in the photo queue, but this is still a continuation of the Clinton era's project of expansion. If you look at Trump's appointees around Europe, they are very, very, almost down the line, anti-Putin hawks. Right? It's one thing for Trump to be forced to keep sanctions going by Congress. It's another thing, he has absolute control over who he appoints, and he feels constrained to appoint traditionalists who believe in primacy and beating back Russian aggression. If we go to Asia, there's a similar story here. That this is the president who ran on a campaign of tolerating nuclear proliferation, having burgers with Kim Jong-un. I'm sure they've both had a few of those. Of actually allowing for a Saudi bomb. And yet, here he is now, I think recklessly, but very aggressively, ramping up a counter-proliferation campaign, threatening preventive war to stop a proliferation crisis in Asia. Not just because he's fearful of a rogue state and a bomb, but because his whole administration is keen to reassure allies, South Korea and Japan. That is a very traditional American anxiety and a traditional American strategy of reassurance. He's increasing quietly freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, right? A quiet attempt to resist Chinese expansionism. And in the Middle East, he has strengthened rather than walked away from a power that he once viciously denounced, that is Saudi Arabia. During the election campaign, he denounced Saudi Arabia for being complicit in 9/11, for being a source of Islamist terrorism. He's just done a gigantic arms deal with them and has embraced them as a pillar of American preponderance and leadership in the Gulf. We can argue in favour or against any or all of these measures to say whether they're wise or unwise, but what they add up to, I think, is something much less interesting than what Trump says in his unguarded moments and in his blistering Twitter rages. That in his most developed articulation of American foreign and defence policy and in his actual behaviour, we see the revenge of the seeds of stability, in fact, not the seeds of tumult. I have my explanation for why this is the case, and we could sort of get into that in the discussion afterwards, but I just want to make a sort of final two quick points. Firstly, there is one significant departure in this document, but it's not so much a change of American grand strategy, it's a change of environment, and that is that we are living amidst, I think, a significant power shift in the world, that America still remains in many measures the wealthiest, most powerful state, but it is no longer a unipolar superpower in the way that it was, that there are middle powers pushing strongly to become regional hegemons, the resources are more limited, that the competition is more stark, and that the danger is not isolationism or disengagement, which is the most frequent fear you hear when people who are sceptical of Trump. It's the danger is the opposite, of continued overstretch, of collision course, of even major war. And that one of the authors of this document is history itself, that history itself is intruding upon this thing, that America may choose to continue to pursue primacy in the world. The environment around it is structurally shifting. And finally, I'd say this also matters because I have a terrible feeling that Trump could win again. That Trump, the person he actually most often imitates and quotes in his speeches is Ronald Reagan. He apes a lot of Reagan's rhetoric. Peace through strength. You remember those old themes. I'm not suggesting you're old at all, my phone. But
my father told me about them.
Indeed. There's another way in which he's quite similar to Ronald Reagan. There is every prospect of Trump's tax cuts, economic policies, massive arms build-up, all of those things stimulating another boom-bust in the American economy. And my suspicion, my fear, is that it's not that Trump will make America great again economically, but there will be a short-term, quite dramatic economic boom, taking America to 3 or 4% growth, which crests just at the time that he's seeking re-election, like Reagan, who I think was a much better president, by the way, but in 1984, and just in time, just synchronising that, choreographing that just at the time, it's actually much harder to very strongly oppose a vulgar, foul-mouthed, reckless president who is creating prosperity. It doesn't mean it's guaranteed, but there could be a significant shift back in the coalition in his favour, and the crash could come when he's into his second term, which is all the more reason to read the document. That's all I have to say. And on that cheerful note, I'll hand over to Mike.
So I'm going to stand up so I can actually see the slides. Have you? Yes, you've noted one of them. So that was a discussion at 35,000 feet. That was a discussion way above. That was grand strategy. I'm going to do exactly the opposite. I'm going to have a discussion about international law. Oral's asked me to talk specifically about international law and in particular about the international law implications with regard to cyber activities, a field that I've done a lot of work in, that you can see in the national security strategy. I will tell you that as an American, I kind of like it. So I don't particularly, I should tell you that I do work for the United States government, and the views that I am expressing at this moment are not necessarily those of the government and are solely in my private capacity. But as an American, I kind of like it. It makes me feel good. America first, make America great again. But having looked at most of the national security strategies that Oral mentioned, because that's what we do at a war college, a lot of it is unexceptional. It may shock you when you read it the first time, when you see we're going to put the safety, interest, and well-being of our citizens first. We're prioritizing the interest of our citizens. We're going to assert our sovereign rights as a nation. It's principled realism. This may shock you, but I've got to tell you, having looked at lots and lots of national security strategies from lots of countries, this is what they all do. It is reassuring in a way, though, because I want you godless foreigners, to know that you will be lifted up by America's renewal and our reemergence as a leader in the global community. So stand by, the lifting is about to hit. Let me talk about law, which is the subject Oral asked me to talk about this evening. National security strategies seldom have a great deal to do with international law. You don't usually look at a national security strategy to find the legal position of a government. What you do as an international lawyer is you read the strategy to try and predict where in the future the legal issues will arise. In other words, it doesn't have answers, but it signals you, be looking for this. So that's what I'm going to do today. There has really only been one national security strategy that was very, very relevant to the law, and that was the one that Patrick mentioned. That was the 2002, September of 2002, national security strategy issued by the Bush administration in the aftermath of 9/11. That strategy was to have been issued by law in 2001, but as a result of the events, it was delayed until 2002. And for international lawyers, we looked at that document because that's where the articulation of the notion of preemptive or preventive self-defense first reared its head. It created for international lawyers a lot of problems because I'm not convinced that the national security strategy meant what it said in legal speak. In other words, I don't know that it marked a dramatically new look at the law of self-defense, but certainly the way it was crafted, it seemed to suggest that, and the international community, I remember it very vividly, nearly swallowed its tongue upon reading this strategy. But that's really the only one that has an international lawyer I can remember in recent memory where the document itself marked out what appeared to be new ground. Now here, in this particular strategy, what we see is a reference to rule of law 19 times. I went through and counted. The rule of law here, it's an interesting way that they use the term rule of law. Rule of law is not used in the sense of limiting what a state may do internationally in the pursuit of its national interest. Rather, it's used in one of two ways. It's used either to, and I'll show you a quote in a second, either to indicate limitations on what the American government may do vis-a-vis its own citizens, which is not usually something you see in a national security strategy. And the second way it's used is in the sense of law and order. So rule of law in this document means we need a state that is governed by strict laws. We're not going to let those evil immigrants in, for example. It's used to protect. Law enforcement, you sometimes see law enforcement in national security strategies, but not a lot. Here it occurs 9 times, which is high. The most unique thing from a lawyer's perspective is the number of times the word sovereignty or sovereign is used. It's used 30 times in this document, nearly every other page. And what this tells us as international lawyers is that this is an inward-looking document from a legal perspective. In other words, this document sees threats coming threats to our sovereignty, and that's what the national security strategy needs to be responding to. International law, this is hard for an international lawyer. It only appears 4 times, doesn't play a big role. Now, when law is talked about in this document, consistent with the notion of there's a threat out there, it's usually seen as a shield against the threat. It's not seen as something that constrains what we can do in the fulfillment of our national security strategy, but rather it's a tool that we can use to face a threat. And you don't have to watch much television to know that we're horribly concerned about those Muslims. And so Sharia law appears here as a potential threat. And then immigration, keep back those Mexicans, build that wall. Law is going to help us protect against all of them. And then with regard to law enforcement, we're very concerned about the protection of intellectual property, and therefore law appears here. Again, law is seen as a shield. Law is seen as a tool by the administration to use against threats. It's also seen as a prop. It's probably, so I'm a Texan, it's a very red state, but I had to go to Rhode Island, a very blue state, to seek sanctuary. So I'm not a big fan of the president. What I see in this document is more, although I agree it was probably written by McMaster and his folks, there is a lot of the president in here, at least when we're talking about law. There's this sort of rhetoric. Law has a prop for internal debates. And so you see the Constitution is used to protect our citizens' God-given rights against who? Against the state. This is classic Republican rhetoric. Or law is used to protect the citizens against abuse of power. Law is used to protect us because it is the state that represents a degree of threat against us. Again, this is not normally what you would see in a national security strategy, but you see it here. It's being used as a prop for a domestic debate that we're having in my country, and you will see it here. This is the most humorous line in the entire document, is that we are a country that upholds the rule of law. I like to think that's true. We respect individual rights, and for the females in the audience, we empower women. This strikes me as a bit unusual in a document coming out of the Trump administration, but there you have it. The proof is in the pudding. There are some issues that are raised in the document that we have been struggling. In fact, people in this very audience have been struggling with for quite some time. I think 2 of those are what has been known as the gray zone debate, and then the other is about legal asymmetry. Let me explain. In the document, it says that we need to be concerned because adversaries and competitors, the other side, the bad guys, are going to operate below the threshold of military conflict. Now, this is, and the world's expert on hybrid warfare is Oral Sari, this is what they're talking about in the militaries. They're talking about there's conflict and there's peace and there's this area in between, and that's where all the problems, that's the gray zone. Okay? In fact, as lawyers, there is no gray zone of law. You're either at war, we call that armed conflict, or you're at peace. That's the absence of armed conflict. It's a binary choice. But what we're struggling with in our community is the edges of international law. In other words, we know there's war, and a particular legal regime applies during war, called armed conflict, and we know there's peace, and a particular legal regime applies there, but we're not so certain exactly where those thresholds lie. So, for example, if there's, and I'll talk about cyber in a moment, if there's a serious cyber attack that does not hurt anyone, let's say it's directed against the economic system and it does not cause damage, does that lie above the line or below the line? Is it the law of armed conflict that applies, or is it the law of peace that applies? And I believe the national security strategy is correct to identify this as a problem with which we're struggling. We will continue. The other is asymmetry. I believe, and I wrote about this several decades ago, many times, a country that is committed to the rule of law, at least in words, faces an opponent that is not. That gives the opponent an asymmetrical advantage in the battlefield. And that's what they're talking about here. It gives them an asymmetrical advantage because I have to conduct my operations consistent with rules of law that limit what I can do, what I could shoot at, how I detain people, what questions I can ask them, how I must treat detainees, on and on and on. And if the opponents don't operate according to those rules, they have, morally, but they have a distinct advantage on the battlefield. So this is something we were struggling with in the Balkans. This is something we struggled with in Afghanistan. We continue to struggle with it in Syria with regard to ISIS, and Iraq with regard to ISIS, et cetera, et cetera. So I believe the national security strategy got it right here by highlighting that this is one of the problems international lawyers are going to struggle with. This is a very, very sensitive topic. This is what many people call extrajudicial killings. This is what many people call unlawful killings, targeted killings. The national security strategy makes it crystal clear that the United States will continue to engage in these operations. It's called something slightly different here. It's called direct action, but we are going to continue to engage in those operations, and we're going to continue to engage in those operations irrespective of where the bad guy is, the so-called bad guy is. This, of course, raises lots and lots of legal issues. I've written about it. Other people in this room have written about this subject, but it will continue. I will tell you my personal view is that some of those operations are unlawful, some are not. You have to do a case-by-case assessment, but we will be doing that assessment into the future. He will continue, this administration will continue what the previous administration, strategy the previous administration had been engaging in, more than even the administration before that. What is new here is who we're going to shoot at. Because if you read the document, it talks about financiers, administrators, and facilitators. And the international lawyers in the audience know this is a big debate. Most of us would agree you may go after members of organized armed groups that are trigger pullers, that are shooters, that are leading the organized armed group in operations against you. But beyond those individuals, it's unclear who we may shoot at. And it has been our policy, American policy, to avoid shooting at anyone other than what we would call a trigger puller or someone who is in command of an operation. And here we are seeing expressly mentioned individuals about which a great debate currently swirls. So this is a very lean forward strategy when it comes to targeted killings, and apparently we will be working with you to do this according to the document. Now let's talk about cyber. The document, in my view, very accurately reflects the current cyber threat, very accurately. It is a threat from state and non-state actors. It is a threat that is across the spectrum of threats, from ransomware to kinetic destructive operations. It has the capability to cause great harm, both to individuals and, of course, to the economic system. It has the potential to disrupt the democratic process, as we have seen. So the document, I believe, fairly captures the cyber threat. The question is, what are we going to do about it? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to lead you. This document says we're the big tamale, we're the big kahuna, okay? We're the ones that will be showing you what to do in order to safeguard the global commons. The global commons being, for example, the oceans or space, or in this document, cyberspace. And we're going to use all of our instruments of national power, which is national security speak for and including military power, in order to safeguard the commons. So this statement is saying that we're taking the gloves off in order to ensure that we have continued access to cyberspace. How are we going to do this? Well, the document points out the fact that the bad guys, jihadi terrorists and so forth, the bad guys, whoever they might be, they take advantage of the fact that they can operate in the dark net, that they can operate without clear attribution. This document says we're going to find those individuals and we're going to go after those individuals. Why is this important to international lawyers? Because those individuals are going to be located in other countries. And so the legal question is, when can a country that is the victim of these operations conduct cyber operations into another country to put an end to those operations? I will tell you, I was in Washington at the State Department talking to some folks there last month. This is a huge issue in my country. It is a huge issue in your country. Just today, I had an email on this subject from someone in your government. The issue of when can we cross borders? What is the effect of the notion of sovereignty on your operations in response to hostile operations will be the hot topic into the future, and it looks as if the Americans are going to be conducting operations that will raise this issue over and over again. So if you're a student looking for something to write on, the answer is sovereignty. You'll become famous. Okay? Moreover, I believe that the document correctly notes that cyber is a weapon with strategic implications, that you may conduct a cyber attack that is, I don't believe it's going to be on the scale of a nuclear attack, but you can conduct a cyber attack that will, as the document notes, dramatically disrupt an economy or dramatically disrupt the ability of the armed forces to deploy and go into combat in order to protect your nation. Why is this important? This statement is important because of the reference to the economy. A major question that we have in cyber is, when does a state have the right to use force to defend itself pursuant to the right of self-defense found in the UN Charter? And the term is armed attack. A state may, in the face of an armed attack, use its own force to defend itself. A question we've been asking for well over 2 decades is, when is a cyber operation an armed attack such that you may now resort to armed force to respond to it? Well, most of us agree, certainly when it causes damage or injury, significant damage or injury. But the big question is always asked is, what about an attack against the economic infrastructure of a country? If someone is conducting massive cyber attacks against the city, can the United Kingdom respond with very robust cyber operations or even military operations against the originator, the author of those attacks? This document would appear to suggest that the Americans are leaning in the direction of a yes answer. Okay? A number of other states have as well. The United Kingdom in some recent doctrine, and also the Netherlands. And then who's going to have the authority to shoot back in cyberspace? Well, it tells us that the federal government, the national government, is going to give authorities to particular entities to respond. Authority is a term of art that we use. It means a legal authorization, for example, for United States Cyber Command to conduct an operation into another state, or even for a private entity to conduct an operation in defense of its own cyber infrastructure. So it tells us that in the event critical infrastructure is placed at risk, there will be authorities that are in place and capabilities that are in place to respond to those operations. I will tell you that is not entirely the case today. Today, this is an area that the United States is working on, and we are going to impose costly consequences now on those who attack us. Now, this raises a number of legal questions. First, the text seems to suggest that we're going to do this in advance of the operation being launched against us. So when the 2002 National Security Strategy talks about preventive self-defense, this begs the question, are we talking about the same thing here in the cyber context? It also raises the issue of, if I'm going to give you authority to respond, I'm going to give you authority to respond in what circumstance of attribution? In other words, what do you need to know? with regard to who launched the operation against you before you can shoot back. So we'll be watching that space. What's the level of attribution that's necessary before whomever is given the authority may pull the trigger to shoot back? And then shoot back how? Are you going to be able to just shoot back to disable the cyber infrastructure being used against you? Will you be able to conduct destructive operations against that cyber infrastructure? Can you shoot at other cyber targets to get them to knock it off? Can you use operations that are destructive? These are big questions, and we should watch this because the administration is telling us, listen, we're going to shoot back, and we're going to shoot back in a big way. And then, finally, in the cyber context, it tells us that we're going to be, when we are responding to these operations, we're going to be risk-informed, but not risk-averse. In other words, when we're conducting a response to a cyber operation, we want to be sensitive to the fact that there may be risks. Risk of escalation would be a good example. But that's not necessarily going to keep us from engaging the operation. Well, that's fine. It's very interesting. But from a lawyer's perspective, what I want to know is, are you talking about legal risk here? And this takes us back to the gray zone. In international law, we know it's a binary system, but there's lots of gray over the thresholds. What do the words mean? Currently, countries like the United Kingdom and the United States, we don't operate in the gray zone. And the reason is we're very sensitive about violating the law or being seen to violate the law. So although some states like Russia and China operate in this zone of uncertainty a lot, we don't. However, does this mean that we're now going to move into the gray zone and ourselves begin to conduct operations that may be legally questionable but not definitively unlawful? In other words, in the past, we looked for operations that were definitively lawful. Now are we going to begin, pursuant to this strategy, of trying to avoid those operations that are definitively unlawful? And this is a very different approach. And anyone know what this is?
Yeah.
Donald Trump's signature.
Right. This is Donald Trump's national security strategy. This is Donald Trump's signature. The man that has this as a signature approved the national security strategy I've just talked about. You may go home and sleep well tonight. All right? All right.